Hello, welcome to our podcast on Rosenshines principles, and our focus today is on Strand 2. So my name is Sadie Garner, I'm Head of Teaching and Learning at Itchen College.
And I'm James Bedwell, PE teacher and teacher and learning coach at Itchen College.
Lovely. So in terms of practice, we're going to look at three kind of key areas. So guided practice, mini practice during a lesson, and of course independent practice.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things to start with that Rosenshine highlights is this idea of guided practice. And we'll talk through maybe different forms what that looks like within the class. But the key thing is here that Rosenshine highlighted that the better or more effective teachers spend more time within lesson time using guided practice. I think, Sadie, you had the stats or something, was it?
Yeah, so
23
minutes for the least effective teachers, and then 40 minutes for the teachers that were considered the most effective.
So ultimately giving students more opportunity to almost play with the material, with the input that they've been given by the teacher, and ultimately put it into all these different forms, whether it's use of whiteboard, whether it is just question and answers, whether it's things like brain dumps that we've made reference to before, building towards practice questions, exam questions, those sorts of things.
Yeah, that kind of we do modelling can also be a really good form of guided practice. I think what's really key is that, like you say, questioning, really good questioning is also part of guided practice. But what it's really clear about is questioning 2 or 3 students in a room is not enough to gauge that every single one of those students has learned. So that's why mini checks or mini practices are really, really, really important. So when you're delivering a lesson and you're explaining brand new content, stopping at multiple points and constantly questioning the students. So material deprivation is the impacts of poverty. What I want to do is just remind me, clear definition, material deprivation is the impacts of, and then as a whole class, they call a response back that it's the impacts of poverty. So you're constantly doing mini checks throughout. And when you're doing that Q&A, trying to make sure that there's really good thought ratio. So you've asked the group what this answer is, but you've waited 10 seconds before selecting anybody. And that means all 27 learners are thinking, and the thought ratio is much better. Whereas if you ask Gemma, only Gemma's thinking, and then when you go to Jacob, they weren't listening and you've got to go back. So just really good thought ratio, but constant mini checks and Q&A, even as you're delivering brand new content, just to check their understanding.
And that's where we said before that whiteboards are really valuable at this stage as well. And we were discussing how we taught before we had whiteboards, but in a position where we can be circulating the room with questions, right, pop your definition down here, or descriptions in here, even if it's a brain dump, part of the exam-based question, sentence starters, those sorts of things, and we can be circulating the class, checking, looking for misconceptions or where students are making mistakes, but in a position where we want lots of repetition and we want all students sort of participating in that practice as well.
Yeah, 100%. We have to be really clear, and again, it does a really amazing example in the book. You wouldn't let them abseil off a building. You just wouldn't let them abseil off a building if you check 2 of them understood and move on. You would make sure every single one of them knew what they were doing, that they showed you how before you'd moved on. And whiteboards, I have to say, I think are the only way I feel, other than a choral response, which I don't want to overuse too much, is the only way I can check every single one of them has learnt that objective. They all know before I can move on. And I think sometimes as teaching, we get worried they get bored, that they've used the whiteboards 4 times in a lesson. They used it at the start, they retrieved it there, then they did a brain dump in the middle, and then they did it again. So mine must use their whiteboards 4 or 5 times a lesson in a 2.5 hour lesson.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
if not
constant,
more.
Yeah. We've now got to a point where we just won't take them off the desk. We don't see any point in taking them back in and putting them back out. So we just move them to the far right-hand side of the room or the far left-hand side of the tables, because they're really key. And I think the thing is with that guided practice is really important that we are not pushing through new material at the expense of practice. Mm-hmm. So we're not ploughing through with the content, and I know we are all desperate to get through that content and it's really tight, but we can't plough through with new content at the expense of practice, because we have to make sure that they understand, otherwise they will form misconceptions. And I had a really lovely conversation with our maths department about how those students have often come in with misconceptions. So they do think 8 to 48 and it's been embedded and it's been learnt incorrectly, and that's such a challenge to then reteach. So it's really, really important that we establish the gaps, and I think more than that, reteach. I think the general rule is if 3 of them don't know, or you're repeating yourself 2 or 3 times, that's the moment to pause the lesson, reteach it, reteach that bit, and recheck before you move on. Because if they've all fallen off at different points in the curriculum, there's no point getting the train at the stop or the exam or the assignment if they've all can't retain it.
100%. And that's why we said, the whiteboard's again so important, because we can be checking, circulating the class to sort of see that and to see where those misconceptions are, and we can be sort of correcting, and I think you used the term sort of live marking as we sort of are circulating the class. But like you say, if there's 4, 5, 6 different mistakes now popping up on the board, then that's an opportunity to stop and almost, like you say, explain, reteach, maybe in a different way. Maybe it might need more modelling, might be a different context, but we're reteaching and modelling. Right, looking at this exam response, I'm going to give you the first sentence. So here's how we're going to start. Some live modelling, talking through my thought processes, couple of questions to check, why have I added this in here? And I think that really sort of links really closely to what Rosenshines suggests in terms of delivery of new content and input of new material, in terms of almost like a 5-step process: teacher explanation, teacher models, we check for understanding, sort of those mini checks. Quickly on your whiteboards here, some good Q&A. Students into their guided practice. So again, they might need some scaffolds in their sentence starters. They might need an acronym to help them remember how to structure a 6-mark response, 10-mark or something like that. And as they become more competent within the lesson, but over a series of lessons, we can start to remove the support and the scaffolding. And then the final step is we're into independent practice. So if that new material that we've delivered, we might be able to get to independent practice with with that material in the lesson, or after a series of lessons, where they don't need the support, they don't need the scaffolding or the assistance of us.
Definitely. I think that guided practice shortens feedback loops. So, the same way, I think sometimes that guided practice or retrieval is generally seen as an A-level thing as well. Whereas really with your VOC, so you've done the delivery, they do guided practice on whiteboards. So you check that AC, you check their understanding, their links to the case study or concepts, check the whiteboards, they're all on it, they're done, perfect, and then they go to their computers and then they do the independent. Because you'll find the errors long before they're doing independent practice, correct it, reteach the room, and therefore you're increasing their success rates and you're reducing your marking.
That's really key, because as a BTEC and A-level PE teacher, being in the position where if you skip from your explanation, new input, new material, maybe the modelling has been a bit rushed or whatever, and then you're right straight over, add this to your coursework, add this to your assignment, you then get 30 submissions with loads of mistakes which could have been addressed through guided practice, through circulating the classroom, finding the misconceptions, reteaching, and therefore it makes your workload a lot easier because you've addressed the misconceptions sort of live in the lesson, and you
Absolutely.
haven't skipped those steps from, input to right, now let's crack on. It's following that sort of step process, so that, well, in the BTEC example, makes your life a little bit easier in the long run. But in A-level PE, we're making sure that we're still getting the correct structured response for a 10, 20 mark, or in your cases, what was it, 30, 35 marks? Yeah.
And it builds confidence, because I kind of perhaps moving on to kind of a bit of independent practice. I don't know where it came from, so sorry not to kind of credit it, but you read so many different things it becomes mashed up. But like about live marking on whiteboards, so we do have little 5 markers. So in the last 8 minutes of a 2.5 hour lesson, they'll on their whiteboards now do independent practice, because we taught all of research methods in the first term. To keep it ticking over, we'll just randomly give them a 5 marker, but they'll write it on the whiteboards, and that gives me a chance to go around and live mark to identify any errors, and also, as I said, it shortens the feedback loop. They're much more likely to respond to my feedback if I say, whilst they're writing the definition, right, we need one more point there. They take and finish it off, and then they get the mark. So it's also quite nice to have this independent practice that's still this live marking on whiteboards, because they're not very threatened by whiteboards, because they can rub it off. They know I'm going around and I'm checking, I'm ticking it when I'm giving it marks, so they're building confidence. And even I think in independent practice, they've still got room to manoeuvre that feedback and add to it if it's on whiteboards.
Definitely, and I think you made reference to confidence there and being able to sort of move into independent practice. I think what's really key for that is what we sort of had a quick reference to before we started this, Eddie, is this idea of an 80% success rate or difficulty for guided practice, being in a position almost where we've got to find the Goldilocks sort of area or level of difficulty. If now the difficulty's too high, we're in a position where lots of students are going to make lots of mistakes, and that can can be detrimental for their confidence, especially if they're moving into independent practice. But also they're going to pick up bad habits and think, oh, that's okay, this is how you do structure a sentence, that was the correct definition, that was the correct level of analysis I needed, whatever it might be. But at the same time, if it's too easy, and Rosenshine makes reference to 70% being too easy, and not challenging enough, in a position where we're not challenging the students sufficiently. So we need to find that right level, and Rosenshine makes reference to, if we do find that level within guided practice, we're in a position where they're more likely to be motivated and confident to step into independent practice without scaffolds, maybe with slightly less feedback, even though we might still be like live marking circulating the classroom. So too hard, too many mistakes, but again, might not find this sufficient challenge if it's too easy. And just on that, I've made a sort of couple of notes here, because when we look at guided practice, we might be looking at using scaffolds to help push sentence structure or response structure. Being in a position where gradually, as students become more comfortable with that, we can start to remove that. So I don't give them the sentence starter, I remove some of the connectives, I take away the acronym they need to use to help create their response. And because they've built their confidence at the right level, they're in a position where they're confident and motivated to still be able to do that when the challenge becomes more difficult, and now they're doing it independently. One of the things I noted was about quizzes, because that actually gives us a percentage, so we can sort of relate to that. So when students are doing a quizzes, once they're in a position, once they've got 3 of the questions at 100%, everyone's getting it correct, whether it's a multiple choice question, whether it's a fill in the blank type question, but removing those to make sure they're still suitable challenge, and replacing them with more difficult questions or different content to help them with retrieval. So that's something to sort of bear in mind, that if the challenge isn't high enough, then we're not stimulating the students. If it's too hard and the quizzes are coming out with 25%, or students can't brain dump more than 3 or 4 words, then the difficulty's too hard, too many mistakes, and it doesn't help to build confidence, build it into independent practice later in the lesson or throughout the year.
Yeah, definitely, because he says 90% is far too easy, 70% is actually too hard, so 80% is the real sweet spot. It is keeping it at 80% is that really, really effective challenge. And I think just kind of on a last point, it's this point that he makes in the book as well, which is if we're really serious about closing the gap in achievement between learners, we can't leave them behind. So it's so important to mini check as you go, to do that guided practice, and to absolutely reteach when there are errors, because that's what will make the difference. And there's nothing more infuriating than when you know you don't know the answer but you still don't know it, that there's an opportunity to have somebody reteach. So really good example is in the, an embedded error of 8/8 to 48. Well, like they're not, but I still think 8/8 to 48 until it's retaught, and like, nope, I ate till I was sick on the floor, 64. So we know the gap, we found the gap, but we do something to help reteach it. So they're confident that they're learning rather than keep being exposed to the same error, rather than having an opportunity to have it retaught. And
then moving on to 9, 12 times table where it becomes more difficult, and they're,
they're already at a low cognitive level.
And I think that's the art of teaching. On the final sort of note, we made reference to, that is recognising the misconceptions and being able to reteach, maybe teach in a slightly different way, and that is the art of teaching. Being able to do that on the spot. Correct the mistakes, mini checks again, whiteboards, guided practice. Maybe they need a bit more support, and then we remove it again once they're more comfortable.
Definitely. It's the joy of the job. Thanks so much for your time, folks. We hope you found it useful.